Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the launch of Thailand Power System Flexibility Study. My name is Pirapat from the International Energy Agency. I work in the Renewable Integration and Secure Electricity Unit, and I will be moderating this webinar. This is a public webinar that the IEA organized in collaboration with Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, or EGAT, with the support from the Ministry of Energy. We are delighted today to have representatives from both EGAT and the Ministry joining our discussions today. I would also like to thank our partners from EGAT and also the European Commission for its funding through the Horizon H 2020 program. You can access the report on the IEA website. You can see in your Q&A box. Just a few housekeeping rules before we start. This webinar is public and is being recorded. The recording will be available on the IEA website. There is also simultaneous interpretations Thai-English. You can choose your language channel by clicking the interpretations button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. In this webinar, the intention is that we will present the key findings from the flexibility studies, which has been released on Monday. There will be also a presentation from EGAT on power system development to support clean energy transitions in Thailand. After the presentation from EGAT and from the IEA, we are planning to have a more in-depth debate in the panel discussions and a short Q&A sessions. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar through the Q&A functions that you can find at the bottom of this Zoom screen. Questions can also be submitted in Thai, and I will translate it if time permitted. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Nitat Vorapon Pipat, the Director of Generation and Transmission System Planning Divisions at EGAT, to give an opening remarks for this webinar launch event. Dr. Nitat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Pirapat. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from Thailand. On behalf of EGAT, we are pleased to be here for launch of Thailand Power System Flexibility Study. It is our real pleasure to be a part of launch event today. This could be considered as the significant movement of the IE integration in Thailand. First of all, we would like to express our appreciation to International Energy Agency, or IEA, for your contribution to the completion of Thailand Power System Flexibility Study. To give you an overview, the study focused on both technical and contractual aspects to evaluate Thailand Power System flexibility with different RE penetration rates, and also provide recommendations and guidelines to apply the most cost-effective and secure flexibility options to the power system. For technical aspects, the study considers flexible power plants, pumped storage hydro, and also battery energy storage system as potential flexibility options. For the contextual aspect, adjustment of power purchase agreement or PPA and failed supply contracts are the critical alternative to unlock flexibility in Thailand power system. The event today could provide us with the directive guidelines to further step and way forward to enhance power system with growing RE shares and disruptive technologies in the future. Therefore, I hope this valuable study will its key findings and recommendations would assist Thailand in moving forward to the more flexible and sustainable power system in the future. Once again, thank you all so much for attending this event and your hard work leading to the great achievement today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nitat, for the openings and provide with a background about this project. Next up, I would like to invite Alejandro Hernandez, the Head of Renewable Integration and Secure Electricity Unit at the IEA, to give an opening remarks. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Pirapat. Dr. Nitus Fora-Pompipat, Dr. Pompat, that's from Bat Pibon, representatives of the Ministry of Energy of Thailand and of the Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, EGAT. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Ministry of Energy and EGAT for supporting this webinar to launch the Thailand Power System Flexibility Report. This full report was released on Monday, 31st of May. Thailand has been critically important member of the IEA family since joining its association in 2015. Since then, and even indeed before that, the IEA collaboration with Thailand has been extensive, spanning joint work on energy security, emergency response, energy efficiency, and statistics. The IEA was pleased to provide extensive support to Thailand's highly successful ASEAN chairmanship in 2019, when the IEA was named a strategic partner to ASEAN. We are proud of what we have achieved in our collaboration with Thailand regarding the power sector. In 2018, the IEA, working closely with IGAT and with the Ministry of Energy, completed the Thailand Renewable Integration Assessment. This provided key recommendations on policies, mechanisms, and tools to facilitate the rapid uptake of renewable energy in Thailand. After this topic, the issue of flexibility was raised. And following that study, the IEA received a request to conduct an in-depth power system flexibility study, which we are pleased to launch with you today. The flexibility study has been completed in close collaboration with IGAT over the past 12 months. It examines flexibility needs from both technical and contractual perspectives and their interactions under the current context of Thailand power sector. We believe the analysis and the key findings from this study will be valuable for the development and continued modernization of Thailand's power sector and for the achievement of a secure and cost-effective clean energy transition. Let me express our sincere gratitude to IGAT for the excellent assistance in this endeavor. IGAT provided us with extensive power system and contractual data and dispatched a highly qualified secondee to work on this project in the IEA. Without this outstanding support, the study would not have been possible. We are pleased that through this long-standing relationship, the IEA has developed extensively analytical expertise on Thailand's power sector, and we look forward to hearing your views on what are the next steps for the IEA to continue supporting Thailand power sector development, particularly coming out of this study. We remain committed to supporting Thailand in this initiative to transition to a low-carbon energy system through the IEA Clean Energy Transitions Program with all fuels and all technologies approach. Let me also thank to all the members of the funding of the Clean Energy Transition Program on our work with Thailand, including the European Commission, a major sponsor to the program through Horizon 2020. I wish everyone a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nitat and Alejandro, for the remarks and also the background of this project and our work in Thailand for the past years also. Now, I would like to start the webinar with the presentations from IGAT. So now I would like to invite Danuyot Dangpradit, the head of Power Development Planning section at IGAT, to first provide an overview of the power system development in Thailand to support the clean energy transitions. Danuyot, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Pirapat, for your quick introduction of myself. My name is Danuyot Dangpradit from IGAT Thailand. It is my great pleasure to meet you all and have a presentation on the launch event of the studies today. Let's start with the first page of my presentation. Presently, we are on the transition stage of the renewable energy and related emerging disruptive technology. The most important role on this stage is the system design to be well accommodated with the rapid change of the technology. And how would we evaluate ourselves on the power system ability to manage with this challenge? Referring to IEA publication on the phase of RE penetration, which highlights on its effect on its penetration to the power system. Thailand is transiting from phase 1 to phase 2 that the RE has minor to moderate impact to the whole system. As aforementioned, to have environmental friendly energy policy and attractive incentives to stakeholders is the crucial part that has to be considered. The mechanism of carbon credit, the RE certificate, will be the useful tools to promote the penetration. On the other hand, the big challenging policy, such as third-party access, market transformation, and regional trading, will play a supporting role along the transition state. In terms of implementation side, the infrastructure, developing and management system will be deployed to support the policy. Nevertheless, the development direction is dependent on each power system context. Hardware and tool selection are mostly in common, but some of them would be tailor-made depending on constraints and existing flexibility options of each system. With the rapid growth of the modern technologies playing a significant role in our industry, the technology referred as the driving factor to push forward the change and energy transition in power industry globally, especially in Thailand. In this regard, the emerging technology could play the supportive part in assisting the power system to be more efficient and cleaner. With the undeniable transition, the power system is hereby need to be upgraded and improved. In future, Thailand would gradually shift power generation from fossil fuel based to be more clean energy. The energy consumption would be cleaner. The power grid would be more resilient and smarter. The power infrastructure would be digitally improved, and innovation landscape and new business models would be further considered. Thailand hereby plans to develop the power system to increase the efficiency of power generation from IE. In preparedness to such transition, Thailand by IGAT has planned to develop the supergrid to support the stability and flexibility of the power system, as well as support the regional power trade. The project, which is in our pipeline considering clean energy and sustainability, are as the instant. The first one is going to the pilot project of grid-scale battery energy storage, which will be installed at our substation, aiming to proficiently manage the power grid where there's high penetration of VRE. The second one is the hydro floating solar hybrid project. In total of 16 power projects within the area of 9 gas dam, with the total installed capacity around 2,700 megawatt. And the third one is go to the Renewable Energy Control Center, which is aimed at the supervising and forecasting of IE generation. And in addition, the modern technologies and innovation in upgrading the power system, such as the artificial intelligence technology, the peer-to-peer power trading platform will be utilized as potential option for beyond of power industry. With the challenge in countermeasure to the global warming situation, renewable energy will become the challenging trend. Thus, this could be the main drive factor, the electric industry worldwide to be transformed to become environmental friendly and the net zero emission society. When we consider upon the latest official PDP 2018 revision 1, which is led by the Ministry of Energy, the three main concepts, which are energy security, economic, and environmental, should be pursued as the same with further adaptation of the implementation phase of the plan. To keep the cleaner energy trend go on, Thailand is on the way to develop the new national energy plan, which is aimed to increase the use of renewable energy, especially on our indigenous resources. The long-term strategy on net zero emission policy will be implemented through various mechanisms, such as the changing of mobility mode from conventional combustion to electric vehicle, the waste to energy management system, the promoting of model agricultural and innovative technology creating sustainability development. With this challenge ahead, ICAT is ready to be an advancing arm for Thailand's next phase of clean energy development. The considering of new evolving technologies like advancing energy storage system from both battery or pump storage with hydro, the hydrogen technology, and etc. has to be considered as future national energy portfolio. Now I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. May I turn to Dr. Pirapat, please?
Thank you, Danuyot, for your presentations. We will hear more about the role of some of the technologies that you have mentioned, like battery energy storage and also the pump storage hydro in our next presentations. Now the IEA will present the key findings from the Thailand flexibility study. So Craig, can you please share the slides, and I will go through. I will just give a bit of background of this project before passing the floor to Craig and Randy to present the key findings on technical and contractual aspects. Next slide, please. So as Alejandro mentioned, this flexibility study is a follow-up to the renewable grid integration assessment that we completed in 2018. So the purpose of that study back then was to understand integration challenges as there were increasing amount of solar PV and of course wind that coming into the system. So the key findings of that study were that much more wind and solar targets were possible compared to the target in the previous power development plan, which is in the 2015 versions. Because Thailand power sector can potentially handle more renewables in terms of from the technical and operational aspect. And from that study, the flexibility has been identified as the key to integrate more solar and wind into the system. So based on that study, we have been asked to conduct a more in-depth flexibility study to understand the value and the impact of the flexibility options, which we are presenting to you today. So as Dr. Nitat mentioned in his speech, that there are two main avenues to enhance power system flexibility in Thailand, from the technical and contractual aspects, which are the main focus of this study. For the technical aspect, this study will analyze the value of technical flexibility options, which consist of flexible power plants, battery energy storage systems, and of course, pump storage hydro, as has been mentioned by Danuyot. For the contractual aspect, we analyze the impact of existing power purchase agreements and fuel supply contract structure on system flexibility. We then identify suitable options for the existing and future contract. These technical and contractual aspects are strongly linked. Next slide, please. Just a brief overview of the generation mix in Thailand. As most of you are aware that gas-fired generation is the largest source of electricity generation in Thailand, accounting for around 60%. Renewables account for around 20%, and this also includes import hydropower from neighboring countries, from Laos. And the share of variable renewables, which consists of solar PV and wind, is only around 4%. According to the PDP, the target of variable renewables, which is wind and solar, is 6% in 2030 and 8% in 2037. That was a bit of the background. And in this study, we will get scenarios with higher share of solar PV and wind. Now, I would like to ask Craig to present the details of the key findings on the technical flexibility aspects, and then followed by Randy to present the details and recommendation from the contractual aspect.
Thanks, Pirapat, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are. As Pirapat mentioned, I'll just be giving a run through of the study from the perspective of the technical flexibility. So in order to analyze the technical flexibility requirements of the future Thailand power system and how these evolve in the short and medium term, we used a production cost model with 30-minute time resolution, modeling the 7 different control regions of Thailand. And the model then explored multiple scenarios based on the different modeling years, so 2025 and 2030, but also different shares of variable renewables, this being our shares of wind and solar PV. Now, the shares of variable renewables considered in the simulation are based on the PDP, as has been discussed already, considering the targets in 2025 and 2030. But we also considered accelerated deployment of variable renewables, so going beyond that which is stipulated in the PDP. And these are based on either taking those 2030 targets in the PDP and pushing them forward for 2025, or from using 2040 targets from the AIMS-3 study. So that's the ASEAN Interconnection Master Plan study, which stipulated 15% variable renewables and bringing these forward to 2030. And so based on these scenarios, we are then able to assess the different flexibility requirements of the system, and then also explore other scenarios which looked at the different flexibility options and what are their potential benefit to the Thai power system in the different years and under the different targets of variable renewables. So, and the flexibility options that we considered were that of power plant flexibility, so looking at things like minimum stable level and faster ramp rates, shorter startup times, also looking at storage, and then finally also to look at gas contractual flexibility, to look at the interaction between the technical and contractual flexibility options. And within the model, we then would reflect the various technical and contractual constraints of the power system. So the first thing to note is as the share of wind and solar increases, this will have an impact on the net demand profile of the power system. And these net demand profiles are important as they're driving the operation of the dispatchable power plants, this being our hydro, gas, or coal-fired power plants. And as the shares of variable renewables increase, the net demand profiles start to diverge from the load profiles. And so this is really driving the change in the operation of these dispatchable resources. This impact is also generally more pronounced during certain periods, such as those where there's low demand or low daytime demand, such as public holidays and Sundays. And then, so as your solar power ramps down towards the end of the day and your evening peak ramps up, you have these very high ramp events. So I think to explore the flexibility requirements and the impact of wind and solar on these, first we can look at how increase in variable renewables and especially solar PV leads to greater swings in the net demand profile within the day. So that is a larger gap between daily minimum and peak net demand. So what we see here in 2019, the daily gap between peak and minimum net demand is in the range of 4 to 11 gigawatts. So this was up to 40% of the daily net peak demand. In 2030, under the PDP scenario, so this is 6% variable renewables, this gap is projected to rise to between 6 and 14 gigawatts across the year, or up to 50% of the daily peak demand. And if we consider our accelerated renewable scenario, so with 15% wind and solar PV, this goes to between 8 and 20 gigawatts across depending on the day across the year. So this is up to 70% of the daily net peak demand. And so this is therefore going to be driving a greater amount of daily cycling of our conventional generation. The increased variability in net load due to rising shares of wind and solar also drives higher ramping requirements. So if we look on the left here, this is showing the case with under the PDP scenario, so 6% wind and solar PV penetration. But if we look at the higher penetration scenario, so 15% renewables, variable renewables, there's a considerable increase in not only the 30-minute ramping, but also the longer duration 3-hour ramping, 3-hour ramps, which have been shown to present challenges for the power system in other jurisdictions as they transition to high shares of variable renewables. What we also see in the slide is how more flexible conventional power plants like combined cycle gas turbines and especially the hydropower are able to be used differently under the high variable renewable scenario and accommodate these higher shares of wind and solar. So ramping up and down with the wind and solar generation to accommodate the generation, the solar generation during the middle of the day, and then ramp up again as the peak demand ramps up. Now, as the flexibility requirements increase, different flexibility options can be considered to allow more cost-effective and technically feasible running of the system. One of those considered was plant retrofits, so where existing thermal power plants are made more flexible with either faster ramp rates, lower minimum stable level, or faster startup times. However, from our study, we found that these retrofits, considering the levels of VRE penetration in the study, so between 6% to 15% variable renewable penetration in 2030, would have limited benefit to the system in both economic and operational perspective. And this is especially so given the constraints in the system due to fuel supply contracts and power purchase contracts, which are currently in place. And although we see the trend of the cost savings increase as we have higher deployment of variable renewables, which is an important trend to note, the savings still from these retrofits remain relatively low, so less than 0.1% of the total system cost, even in the scenarios with the accelerated renewable uptake. What the results did, however, show is that when looking at certain retrofits in isolation, it showed that the lowering of the minimum stable level, which in turn allows the power plants to accommodate this daily gap or this greater swing in net demand that we looked in the previous slide, this allows a much greater savings than other plant retrofits. And this really suggests that this should be one of the priorities when negotiating new power purchase contracts with IPPs, because these power purchase contracts are often constraining the plants below their actual technical capabilities. Meanwhile, if we look at the investment side of things and the economic impact of these retrofits, we see that the investment cost of plant retrofits would far outweigh the operational cost savings. And again, this is suggesting that instead of plant retrofits, things such as modifications to the certain plant's operational procedures, so especially that for IPPs, or looking at market and regulatory incentives should rather be considered as options to potentially unlock latent power plant flexibility before prioritizing things such as plant retrofits. Further scenarios then also explored the benefit of deploying storage in the future Thailand system. So the Thailand power system already has about 1.2 gigawatts of pumped storage hydro, but here we looked at further deployment of pumped storage hydro or battery energy storage systems, and with the results showing that the deployment of these technologies can lead to more efficient use of cheaper generation sources during off-peak periods, while also displacing more expensive peaking capacity during peak periods. It also allowed for better utilization of the variable renewables, reducing the need for curtailment, although in actual fact, the amount of curtailment in the model system was very low and only really occurred during periods of very low demand in holiday periods around New Year's Day. And so despite their technical capability in providing flexibility service for the future Thai power system, both these storage options, the savings from both these storage options, even in isolation and when paired with flexible power plants, is still relatively modest. Again, less than 0.1% of total costs of total generation costs. And this is even with the accelerated deployment of renewables, so a 15% target in 2030. And at this stage, the cost of investing in new pumped storage hydro or battery energy storage plants would still far outweigh the operational cost savings from these flexible options. And actually, what this results in, as well as the result of the power plant flexibility options suggest, is that the Thailand power system, through its flexible hydro, its gas fleet, as well as its pump storage hydro, already possesses this inherent technical flexibility to manage the increased flexibility requirements of the system when deploying up to 15% wind and solar PV. And this is without any additional investment in flexibility options outside of the PDP. So in addition to assessing these flexibility options in isolation, it was also of interest to look at how these options would work in combination. So the combination of flexible power plants and storage. And the results from the model showed that despite their relatively small benefit in operational cost savings, these options are still complementary to one another. And this is a positive result, which shows that if Thailand, as Thailand further accelerates its clean energy transition, the country should still be considering the use of these flexibility options and a combination of them in its long-term planning to accommodate a great ambition for renewable energy deployment. Finally, to better understand the implications of contractual constraints on the optimal operation of the system, a further scenario also looked at the impact of flexibility or adding flexibility to gas supply contracts. So here the result really puts things in perspective, showing that the potential benefit of more flexible gas contracts would be almost 10 times greater than a scenario where we consider both flexible power plants and storage. And in addition to this, flexible contracts would also unlock the ability for these flexibility options that we explored, such as storage and flexible power plants, to provide even greater benefit. And so this is really why really highlights the importance of the contractual flexibility component, which my colleague Randy will be exploring later on in the presentation. So that brings me to the end of this discussion on the technical flexibility component. I think just to summarize, what I'd like to say is that, as the shares of wind and solar increase in the power system, so too will the flexibility requirements of the power system due to the changing net demand profiles, which in turn drive higher ramping requirements and a larger gap between minimum and peak demand. And this drives the operation of the rest of the power system. And so therefore, these new flexibility requirements should be reflected in both the operational practices of the power system, but also in the planning of the system. But I think what I really want to highlight is the good news is that the Thailand system already has a large amount of inherent flexibility thanks to its gas, hydro, and pump storage fleet. And the model really shows that it should have no issue in integrating shares of up to 15% in wind and solar. And this would be namely 19 gigawatts of solar or 6 gigawatts of wind, as modeled in the accelerated VRE scenario. And so even though flexibility options such as storage and flexible power plants can provide benefit, this is not necessarily a priority in the short and medium term in the current context of the Thailand power system. Instead, contractual constraints such as those reflected in the PPAs and fuel supply contracts are higher priority, as these are really limiting mobilizing the technical flexibility of the system and preventing the use of otherwise available and cost optimal resources in the system. But of course, as Thailand accelerates its clean energy transition with more renewables, flexible power plants and storage options can play a vital role in increasing the flexibility of this future system. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. And over to you, Pirpat.
Thanks, Craig. Now I'd like to pass the floor to Randy Christensen, who is the economics and financial analyst. So she'll be talking about contractual flexibility. Randy.
Thank you very much, Pirpat. And as Craig said, this is a very important component of the Thai flexibility for the future. First of all, I want to give a quick overview of what we did. So the commercial flexibility is provided by the underlying contractual structures and institutions. And this study, we really dived into the PPA structures and the fuel supply contracts. what's really important to say here is that we really want to stress that we thank EGAT for providing us access to this data. It is for the IEA a groundbreaking study where we link the technical flexibility to the institutional flexibility. And what we actually find in a lot of emerging economies, including Thailand, is that the contractual structures can provide a big barrier to unlocking the needed flexibility to integrate renewables. So the fact that EGAT provides us the insight to make this analysis is much appreciated. If we start by looking at the PPAs, we here have a figure that shows how the different contracts will expire over the coming years until 2048. And as you see here, a lot of the contracts will actually remain as they are until 2033, where we will start to see some of the IPP contracts for gas especially expire. Hydro, especially imported hydro, will expire much later, not before 2035. If we look at how the capacity of the system is going to develop, you'll see that the capacity margin will decrease from a little bit over 30% now to around 25%, which is still a very decent capacity margin. Even though contracts will expire, you'll have new capacity coming into the system. The shares of gas and hydro will remain more or less stable in the system, and there will be an uptake in renewables. What we did to investigate the contractual flexibility is that we did a few scenarios, especially where we looked at high renewables generation, both in the off-peak and peak, as well as low renewables generation in the off-peak and peak, and then looked at what are the different contractual assumptions that you have. For example, that cogeneration, you have to take 65% of the capacity in the off-peak, while in the peak you have to take 100%. It's also really important to state that the peak consumption demand is not the same for the different scenarios, because we wanted to take a situation where the demand, for example, for peak and high renewables, how that reflects each other. So for example, there can be some seasonality. For example, when there's a lot of solar generation, maybe there's also a lot of demand for cooling, space cooling, which will then increase demand. So in that sense, we chose some days that reflect a potential high renewables generation, but also the corresponding high peak demand for that session. Also, we looked at scenarios with a normal or the projected PDP VRE build out, and then an accelerated case. If we look first at the scenario where we have low renewables with peak demand, you'll see that until 2025, you actually have a situation where the minimum take obligations of 65% in the off-peak exceed the projected demand, which means that you have to take a lot more generation than you actually can use for your demand. So already here, there's an inflexibility in the system in a low renewables scenario. If we then look at what does a high renewables scenario look like with a peak demand, you'll see that the peak demand actually increases quite significantly, and that the contractual structures in this scenario is not a big problem, because the must-take obligations that you have are below more or less demand. So right now we're seeing in this situation that it's especially the off-peak minimum take obligations that hinder flexibility in the system. If we then have a situation where we have high renewables, but in the off-peak again, then there's a big problem, because you don't have the demand to actually cover all the minimum take generation. So, and this is a problem in the entire period that we are analyzing until 2030. And this says something that about the contractual structures are too inflexible to allow integration of renewables, and it's going to stay that way for quite a long time. So it's not necessarily just an option to let the contractual structures run out. So when you see a situation where the system has this inherent flexibility barrier from the contractual structures for a long time, restructuring active contracts might be a preferred option in order to utilize the technical flexibility to integrate higher shares of renewables. You also see, as Dr. Nitis mentioned, that there's a good development going on in Southeast Asia with multilateral power trade, and especially IGAT and Thailand are at the forefront and very supportive of this development. So it's also important for the Thai system to keep exploring multilateral power trade and flexibility options, because some of their import right now, for example, is hydro from Laos. And that hydro has the potential also to be flexible. So if you implement more flexible cross-border arrangements, then this import can actually contribute to the overall flexibility of the Thai system. Obviously, as we saw, relaxing these minimum take obligations will give IGAT the option to optimally dispatch on the basis of marginal costs. This is not to say that IGAT doesn't currently dispatch on the basis of marginal cost. It's just to say that if you have a situation where you have minimum take obligations, then that will change your marginal cost structure, because the fuel cost of the gas will be a sunk cost. So in essence, it will move the thermals down in the merit order. It's really, really important to say that when considering restructuring contracts, it needs to be done with extreme care, because what you don't want to do is to shock the investment market so that you create future higher costs for investing in the country. One option to restructure contracts could be using auctions, where you could auction out some new contracts and you could see what requirements your generation fleet has in terms of compensation to change to those types of contracts. This means that the situation or the process of restructuring contracts should be voluntary, and a competitive process allows you to do it in the most cost-effective way. I will also just stress that when starting to look at the possibility of restructuring contracts, stakeholder engagement is really, really important. So listening to the asset owners, the IPP owners, the financial institutions to figure out what parts of the contract is valuable to them, and where you potentially could restructure with a win-win situation is really, really important. So thorough dialogue with stakeholders is an important part of a restructuring process. Again, as I said, it should really not be taken lightly. It's really the last thing about restructuring contracts that I want to say is that it should be done in a process where IGAT assets can compete with IPPs on a equal and fair basis in terms of new contracts. This will make sure that the assets across the system that are the most suited to restructure their contracts will be selected, irrespective of who owns the assets. So, for example, it can be that an asset has low debt ratio, which means that they require less certainty on generation. It can be that one asset really has a good advantage in terms of technology and ramp rates, and by that can cheaper ramp. So there are many factors that decide which assets are the ones that you need to restructure. And it's also important to say that if you do it through an auction process that is competitive, you don't need to restructure all contracts in your system. You need to identify how many contracts, how much volume you want to reduce your minimum take obligations with, which can be derived from our analysis. and then only need to restructure that amount instead of doing a sweeping restructuring of all current contracts. It's also really, really important to note that given that we've identified these issues and these barriers in the current contractual structures, any new PPAs that are entered into in Thailand should really fulfill more flexible contract terms already now, to ensure that you don't increase the problem in the future or keep on this track with new assets. Also, we looked at the fuel supply contracts because as Craig showed, it really does limit flexibility. Just like the minimum take obligations in the PPAs, the fuel supply contracts can be a limit to flexibility by, again, changing the merit order. In Thailand, especially the gas contracts impact the power system flexibility. This is due to very high take-or-pay obligations that impact the marginal cost of generation. So what we see is that gas turbines are really, really technically very flexible, but when you have to pay for the gas, take-or-pay for the gas, then it makes no sense not to use them. So you'll treat the gas with these very restrictive take-or-pay contracts, you end up treating the gas as a sunk cost. So if we look at how the gas contracts are structured in Thailand, and we reduce the volume that the gas that's needed for power supply, there's a need for restructuring again. Luckily, some of these contracts with EGAT already have built-in revision periods, which could be utilized to say, okay, we need to lower some of the minimum take or the take-or-pay obligations for our contracts. And we've shown some of the contracts that might be a candidate for doing this. It's also really important to say that going forward, it's important to do the gas purchase from a portfolio perspective. This means that you should, or the gas portfolio needs to be structured to take into consideration three main aspects. Obviously, there needs to be a security of gas supply because this impacts electricity security. The gas contracts need to be more flexible, have lower take-or-pay amounts. But obviously, you also need to look at affordability because more flexible contracts are inherently more expensive. But it's important not to lock yourself into looking at the price of an individual contract. It should be the entire system cost that is evaluated. So having an overall slightly more expensive gas portfolio, if you don't use as much gas, is acceptable. For example, LNG can be a very flexible option where offtake obligations are potentially monthly or yearly. Other instruments like options can be used to also ensure security of supply. So when looking at a portfolio approach, the minimum level of gas that you know you're going to need because you know how much renewables you have in your system, you can buy those on very inflexible contracts with the high take-or-pay obligations that you see right now, because the take-or-pay contracts in that situation are not going to be a problem. But when you look at the variable part of the gas demand, you need to structure them with more flexible contracts to take into account that the demand for the gas can really vary due to the variable renewables being introduced into the Thai system. That was all for me, and I would like to pass it back to Pierre. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Randy, for the key findings. I think we will discuss more during the panel discussions. I'd like to also prompt the audience to post questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to address them and respond both through the box and perhaps during the panel discussions. We'll try to do as much as we can. Now, I would like to invite all of the panelists to switch on the camera. Dana Kenny from USAID Clean Power Asia. So now we have the panel discussions. Now we have Dr. Poonpat Lee Sombat Pipun from the Ministry of Energy, Dr. Nitat, who gave the opening speech, Dana Kenny, who is the Chief of Party of USAID Clean Power Asia, and of course, Randy from the IEA to join the panel discussions. Given the issues of the net zero carbon emissions has gained a lot of attention in many countries, which we see a lot of countries have announced targets in the next 20 to 30 years about the net zero carbon emissions. And this is also related to one of the questions from the audience as well. This issue also received a lot of interest, and as you probably know that the IEA has also recently released a flagship report on the net zero. And I also believe that the net zero carbon emissions has also been discussed in Thailand. So now I would like to ask Dr. Poonpat from the Ministry of Energy aspect, what is the strategy and plan to support the net zero carbon emissions in Thailand, and particularly the role of renewables and other emerging technology such as electric vehicles? What do the governments see as the main challenges for power sector decarbonization? Dr. Poonpat, if you could give us a bit of overview on this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pirapat. First of all, I'd like to say good morning to people in Paris and good afternoon to people in Bangkok. And I would like to thank you very much for inviting me to join this panel today. First of all, as a government role, as you asked me the questions about how can we address the challenge on our carbon policy neutral. I would like to say that under the policy of the Ministry of Energy, we are striving for the promoting the clean energy development in our national energy policy. Right now, we are moving. In the past, we have the Thailand Integrated Energy Blueprints, which cover between the fossil energy, that is oil and gas, and also the alternative energy and energy efficiency, and also power development plan. And in the power development plans, we are striving for moving in a more bigger share for the alternative energy in our power generations. We set the goal for at least 30% of our IE in our power fuel mix, and that is the goal that we are trying to increase more in the near future. And as we can see that after the COVID-19 and we are approaching to the COP26 as well, I also have a chance to join the session that has been organized by IEA between the COP and the IEAs. And we have seen that many countries also moving towards the carbon neutral as well. So I think by this way, I would like to emphasize that Thailand is now in the same direction as the world in moving from our fossil fuel base to be more cleaner and more using more the renewable energy in our country. But I see that the challenge that we have to be in balance between this energy transition is that first of all, we need to taking care on how fast and how we move the track of our changing in this transition, because we have to be responsible for our people in the country as well. So the questions about the affordability is also one of the big questions that we have to be in balance. And the second thing is about the technical requirement, and I'm also very happy to learn more from a presentation by the experts in the previous expert that we have been. You have been showing me that there are some progress in the technical feasibility to deal with the VRE in this case. So that means the cost of the technology is now might be moving down and more feasible for us to handle with the VRE to coming up more in our fuel mix. And the second and the third thing might be about the security of our country. So we have to be in balance and have to maintain the diversification policies so that we can generate the optimum security for our power generation system. That's my first response to you, Dr. Pirapat.
Thank you, Dr. Poonpat. Maybe just the quick question. There's one from the audience, which asking about if there's a time frame that Thailand might be transitioning to like 100% clean energy. Is there any target years that have been discussed?
For being achieved the RE 100 for Thailand, I also, it is my dream as well to see that kind of situation to happen in Thailand. But as I told you, the path to moving towards in that direction, we have to make sure manufacturers are compliant to our national requirements and also the security requirement as well. So in this case, I think that RE 100 can be feasible by first of all, we have to see the technical feasibilities in this case. And the second thing is about how can we make the people in our country to be more understand and accepted to the new change in this direction. And so I think by that way, both politically feasible and economically feasible, that will be moving the goals towards RE 100.
Thank you, Dr. Poonpat. Now I'd like to turn to Dr. Nitat from IGET. As presented by Craig and Randy, that the contractual inflexibility and constraints can limit mobilizing technical flexibility options, and this can reduce the cost effectiveness of Thailand's power system. So I'd just like to ask Dr. Nitat, given your numerous experience in PPA negotiations in your previous role at IGET, what do you see as the main challenges in making the existing and of course the future PPAs and fuel supply contracts to be more flexible in order to promote the cost effectiveness in terms of the power system operations? And have there been any changes to the reasons and future PPAs compared to the past PPAs? Because the first PPA has been signed for IGET with IPP, I think for around 20 years already. So yeah. Dr. Nitat, if you could provide an overview on that, please.
Thank you, Dr. Pirapat, for this question. It's very interesting. And I think the people would like to know about the existing and the future PPA and the impact of the from this report, I think. So I would answer the question by two parts. The first part is the existing PPA. So as everybody knows that that is the general for the contracts and the agreements must be kept. We have to respect our agreement that we have signed. So, and as Dr. Pirapat says, the PPA was signed many years ago. At that time, we not aware with the VRE and so we provide the not much flexibility of the power plants. We just have the maximum generations and minimum generation and also loading rate and deloading rate for a limit that we have from our experience that enough to control and make grid reliability and stability of the power system to balance the imbalance and between load and demand, generation and demand. So we could not do much with the existing PPA because if we re-investigation on the existing PPA, it will impact to the investor, and the cost of the changing in the PPA will transfer to the electricity tariff. and I don't think we can make change in the existing PPA. So what we have to do is we can look at the pattern of the dispatch and make operating or the dispatcher to revisit on the generation planning to absorb the variation of the renewable energy by using the IE forecasting or something, and that we can adapt ourselves for the system operator instead of the changing the existing the PPA that will impact to the electricity tariff. So that is my answer for the existing PPA. But for the future, Ms. Landy Christensen also said about the for the short term and medium term, we may not need the mass flexibility study. But as you know, when we sign the PPA, we sign the long term the PPA. So we have to reduce the minimum generations. And we should increase the number of start-stop, and also we have to revise the loading rate and deloading rate to ramp up to serve the variation of the renewable energy. And this number, as Randy says, we have to figure and determine how much we need, because all what I said will impact to the risk and to the maintenance cost of the power plant. That will lead to increase in the tariff and also investment cost. So we have to do that, but we have to make an intensive study what amount that we need and necessary for the power system. And together with the increasing of the IE, from this report, we have 15%. But as Dr. Pumpipat said today, we have ambition to make or integrate renewable energy more than 15%. That is the goal of the Thailand. And also for the failed contract or the minimum take, actually the minimum take of that stated in the PPA come from the minimum take of the failed agreement. And if we change that too much, it will impact to the gas business too. So that is we have to make the intensive study. What is amount that we really need for the power system, and then we will action and we will put in the future PPA as soon as possible. Thank you very much. That is my question for this turn.
Thank you, Dr. Nitat. That is really helpful, and also good also to hear about the future PPAs that will consider negotiations in terms of looking at operational characteristics like startup time, minimum levels, and ramping requirements. Because in our study, we also find that the minimum stable level is the one key factor that can reduce the overall system cost quite a lot. Now I'd like to turn to Randy. If you have additional comments from for Dr. Nitat's response, and also just to follow up on the issue of contracts, that one of the questions that we would like to, private sector might want to hear is that how should we implement new PPA in fuel supply structures in order to keep the confidence of the investors, not to drive them away, and what would be the appropriate options? From Randy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Priyapat. I'm really happy to note Dr. Nita's comments that contracts should be respected. I very much agree on that point. The point we're making in the study in terms of renegotiation of contract is a voluntary process. So if you want to go down that route, it cannot be something that the government or the utility imposes on anyone. It has to be a voluntary process. And that's also why I mentioned that stakeholder processes is really important if you go down this route. In terms of implementing contracts in the future that provide flexibility, but also provide stability and don't scare investors away, there's a lot of things you can do. For example, it's really important for a country to be very transparent with their data, their demand forecast, their projected investments in generation, so that the investors can evaluate the potential path that the energy system is going down and can see how their asset fits into that scenario. I also think that there are options in PPAs to make them more financial than physical, which means that you, in order to gain the flexibility that you need, you can make financial compensation. For example, saying, instating a minimum floor on financial compensation. Also differentiated pricing in terms of the value that the asset brings to the system is going to be important. So balancing these types of measures in order to find the optimal combination that works for the system, but as well as the investors, because obviously it's important to make sure that you don't implement PPA structures that are so insecure that the required rate of return for investing in Thailand will increase a lot, because that will then make the clean energy transitions much more expensive. And I really, really do want to stress that it's not just about flexibility, it's about affordability and security as well. So in that sense, it is a very complicated question, and that's also why again, I want to stress extensive stakeholder consultation is really a good venue to go down when you're looking at future PPA structures and flexibility options. Also for the fuel supply contracts, if it's for IPPs, it's very much a component where IPPs can compete with each other, because the IPPs that are better at structuring their fuel supply contracts with the needed amount of flexibility are the ones that are going to have the lower marginal costs and thus perform better in the system and be more attractive for EGAT to dispatch, and can be more attractive when bidding into PPAs, for example. So in that sense, it's going to be, it's a competitive to some extent parameter. I also want to note that I know a lot of international audiences will ask, well, why don't you just say you need to restructure the entire market and make it a market-based competitive market, as we see in other places? That is a natural question to ask, but it is not for the IEA to say that that Thailand should restructure their market. This is what we wanted to do, was to make a study that takes the current context of Thailand into account and provides very tangible short-term suggestions on how to increase flexibility without putting a big task like restructuring their markets on Thailand, because this is very much a political and national decision for Thailand to make. If that's the route they want to go, if that's not the route they want to go, they still can increase flexibility and integrate renewables with the market structure that they have. I think that's my initial comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy, for raising an important point that, we focus on the current structure of the market in Thailand, which is still, enhancing your buyers, because, changing structures can be quite a challenge. So we consider what we can do based on the existing structure. Now I'd like to turn to Dana. Dana, how do you see the role of regional power trade and interconnection in supporting the clean energy transition in Thailand and of course in ASEAN regions? because this issue has been discussed quite a lot, and your team has been involved in this aspect in terms of multi-power lateral trade and interconnections, what would be the key recommendations and the next step? And this is based on the current, the recent AIMS-3 studies that you're conducting with the ASEAN Center for Energy. And of course, this question also received interest because there's one audience that are asking about the possibilities of expanding multilateral power trade in GMS and in ASEAN in order to support renewables. Of course, the IEA has done a study on that as well, but we want to hear your view, Dana.
Very good. Well, actually, I rely a lot on the IEA study to lay out what some of the issues are that need to be addressed going forward. And as you know, this study, the AIMS-3 study, was one of 3 that was intended to look at kind of a 3-legged stool moving towards multilateral trade. So let me give a little background about AIMS-3 and then end with where further action leads to multilateral trade. We hope the path leads there. So as we all know, cross-border integration of power systems diversifies resources and can lower overall power system costs and require fewer resources to meet the same peak demand. And as IEA noted in some of their studies, power trade increases the balancing area, enabling increased VRE resources that are key for the energy transition. So what is AIMS-3? It led by Hapua, which is the heads of ASEAN power utilities and authorities with support from the ASEAN Center for Energy. It was funded and we were involved, the USA Clean Power Asia program, in developing this regional plan that forms the basis for development of the ASEAN power grid. It was the 3rd study and differed from the previous ones by having a longer time horizon and looking at some options for how power trade could flow through several countries, not just those that share borders. One scenario that was looked at compared to the base case, by the way, the base case represents existing power development plans. And one scenario on top of that was the power sector contribution to the ASEAN 23% of primary energy RE target by 2025. So as some people may know, and maybe most of you know, that target includes transportation and industry. So the power sector's contribution was estimated to be about 10 to 15% of capacity as VRE, which is about 95 gigawatts in 2025 and increasing to 126 by 2030 and then the same in 2040. The other scenario was a higher VRE target that would grow beyond 2025 up to 45% of capacity or 504 gigawatts by 2040. So some of the key findings are that integrating high levels of variable renewable energy in the region, looking at the region as a whole, is technically and economically feasible and facilitates increased power trade. So for ASEAN as a whole, power trade increases by over 200% for the ASEAN RE target scenario and over 400% for the high renewable energy scenario. And system-wide, the report notes that the flexibility throughout the whole time horizon continues to be hydro and natural gas. Now, one thing I'll mention later is the high amount of curtailment in the later years. There were no flexibility options evaluated as part of this study. It was just to look at what would happen with the higher VRE. But not a lot of issues need to be addressed with the transmission in countries. There are some that need to be strengthened. Anyway, in Thailand, the higher VRE installed results in a slight increase in gas use for balancing, but a large reduction in coal when you get out to 2040. And for both of those scenarios, Thailand's power trade increases the most with Malaysia, followed by Cambodia, and then Myanmar or Laos, depending on the scenario. Significant interconnection capacity is added for the high renewable energy target scenario. And it does enable sharing of reserves and solar availability for more hours of the day across the whole of Southeast Asia. Though the study itself didn't provide specific recommendations, at the ASEAN Ministers of Energy meeting in 2020, the energy ministers increased the overall renewable energy capacity target by 2025 from 30 to 35%. So earlier I used 12 to 15%, that's generation. This is the capacity target. And that additional 5% is supposed to be provided by solar and wind. And so the next steps that have been determined by HAPUA and ACE together include a plan to meet the 2025 RE target, somehow linking it to individual country PDP updates. In the past, the plan for the grid was put out there and the potential trade was documented. And as with the other studies, with this one, there's been participation from all the ASEAN member states. All of the assumptions have been cleared by them, and they've been involved in reviewing the results. But there hasn't been a process to link it to PDP updates. Also, they want to talk about longer term RE targets, especially for the power sector. And there will need to be further analysis of the proposed interconnections in detail. Although a production cost modeling was done, some studies where you look at two countries together are the ones that would trade. Not just studying it, but looking at how it would operate will be important. And then moving forward in supporting investment of RE generation and interconnections. And for the foundation of the multilateral markets, in addition to trying to increase the amount of bilateral trade, or as the IEA study calls it, enhanced bilateral, like the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia trade that's supposed to expand to Singapore. Harmonizing grid codes and other regulations will be important, and pilot markets could certainly be implemented. And then they have to present an implementation plan for AIMS-3 at AMEM this September. So that is the plan for AIMS-3, and I will be happy to answer any questions when it is time. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Oh, sorry, thank you, Dana. I was going to ask you, Randy, so that's why I mentioned your name, Randy. Because we've been working a lot in the cross-border multi-power lateral trades. So what's your view on this in terms of the the development of the multilateral trade and the cross-border interconnections, and how would it support the clean energy transitions? Of course, not only in Thailand but in ASEAN as a region.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I also want to say thank you very much to Dana, because the AIMS-3 and involving us in this work is really important. And I think in general, the good collaboration across AMS and across donors is really impressive in this effort to increase multilateral power trade. Again, I really want to note that Thailand is proving to provide strong leadership in the efforts to pursue multilateral power trade in the region, especially exemplified by their chairmanship of ASEAN back in 2019. I think multilateral power trade is really, really important for integration of RE across the region and in Thailand. As mentioned, Laos, for example, the hydro resources in Laos can be a really important facilitator of flexibility for example, Thailand. I also think that the vast resources that countries like Thailand have can be an important tool for countries like Singapore, who have less land to achieve their sustainability goal. And I think in general for the region, the collaboration in clean energy transitions is to the benefit of all consumers across the region. With that being said, I think there are many different ways that this can develop. I would very much caution against doing very long bilateral contracts, because that kind of effectively ends up in the same situation that you have with the PPAs, that you get stuck in these very, very long physical contracts that are not flexible. So looking into developing models that are more flexible and that work on shorter timescales is in my view, really a really important tool for increasing flexibility in the region. I also want to note that we did a study on renewables integration that Pierre-Pat, you led, that showed that if you integrate Southeast Asia without a holistic view towards renewable policies, then you actually run the risk of increasing emissions in Southeast Asia. So it really goes hand in hand. Renewable policies along with multilateral power trade are really important hand in hand to ensure that the region reaches their sustainability goals. I also want to note that developing multilateral power trade is not a simple task. It is tying together systems of national security, energy systems. So obviously it is something that takes time. But I think that Southeast Asia as a region is on a good path. And I think that the AMS are showing real collaboration that is very impressive.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks again for Dana for the details of the AIM-3. In fact, we also refer the scenarios of AIM-3 in terms of renewables, but we accelerated from 2040 in having 15% variable renewables to 2030. And it was good to be part of the technical review group as well for the AIM-3. Now, I would like to turn to IGAT and also the Ministry of Energy on the issue of decarbonizing the power sector, because we received a lot of questions on this as well. What do you see as we presented, for the clean energy transition, flexibility resources will play a key role to support the transitions in a secure and a cost-effective way. Has the issue of flexibility been discussed or considered in the policy framework? Because it has been mentioned in the PDP 2018, but I believe that this is undergoing some kind of revisions. So how is this being considered in the upcoming PDP? So perhaps I start with, I don't know, who should go first? Dr. Nitat or Dr. Poonpat? Maybe Dr. Poonpat, please.
Yes, for the questions about the flexibility, I think this is the in the roles of the decarbonization. I agree that the flexibility from the VRE, if we can enhance that part, this will be a big change in the RE integration to our power systems, and that can also benefit to generate the clean energy in overall and lower the carbon footprint in our countries. But in terms of the flexibilities, we have to, on one hand, on the benefit side, I think many people already mentioned about that. But on the other side, that we have to take into account on how much we need to do the investment on that part as well. Because at the end of the day, the cost of that investment might be passed through to the consumer in terms of the final electricity tariff. So that we have to make sure that the change will be moved in gradual manners and have a well planned in advance. And also in terms of the policy maker point of view, we suggest that these things can be discussed further so that both sides, IGAT and the ministry, can work together on this part to achieve the goals.
Thank you, Dr. Poonpat. I'd like to hear the view from Dr. Nitat as well.
Thank you, Dr. Peter Pass. Dr. Poonpat, he is a policy maker. So for IGAT, we as a license operator, and we provide the information to the policy maker. And what about the information that I would like to talk today is about we have the goal to integration of the renewable energy into our system. So that is the reason why we cooperate with many organizations such as famous like the IEA, and also we have many study projects on the integration of the IE into our system, including make the grid modernizations, and we make our grid to more flexible by install the digital equipment, such as we have the project like digital substations and also digital power plants. Today we have discussed with many experts, and we can see that the transition from the conventional era to the IE era, that I would say that is very important. So flexibility of the system is the key role. If we have high flexibility in the system, we can accelerate the target of the integration, the IE into our system faster or sooner. And so the transition is very important. To make it happen during the transition, we have to balance with the investment that we put into the system to make the grid more flexible, to make the power plant more flexible, and also put the hydro, the pump storage, hydro, and also battery energy storage system. That is in our plan and in our study. But the one thing that's very important for Thai people is that after post-COVID, we are in the difficult period. So the electricity tariff should not maintain and try to reduce. And we have to balance the new investments and also the IE integration and also the plant flexibility to make the balance with that. So the technology, the new technology that make it possible and the cost competitive and can maintain the tariff in Thailand, that will be challenging. So I would say that we still keep going on the IE integration in Thailand, but we have to balance what I said, the tariff affordable of the people and affordability of the people, and also the security and the goal of the IE integration. That is the three roles that we have to balance, and we will put in the new PDP sooner. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Poonpat and Dr. Inhat. It's great to hear in terms of the policy that are considering these issues, from the policy aspect as well as from the technical aspect, in order to maintain the affordability and also the security of the power sector when we consider in terms of integrating more renewables to support the clean energy transition in Thailand. We almost run out of time, but I have one final question, and this is, we received quite a lot from the audience as well, and this might include the questions from ourselves at the IEA as well, that from what you've seen in the study that we did, what are some of the main questions and issues that are arising from this analysis that we should examine further? Because the IEA is very keen to take the next step to follow up of these studies. And the questions from the audience is also related to, is there any plan if we're going to consider the net zero carbon scenarios for Thailand in the next phase of our study? So I'd just like to hear the view of both the ministry and also from the IGAT, who we have been working closely with and will continue to work closely going forward. So perhaps Dr. Nitat, if I can start from you on this.
Yeah. So from the study, I think Ms. Landy Christensen also said about the market auction, voluntary, and also competition that also present in the report. So I think that is a very good idea, because if I put the all requirement into the standard PPA all the investor have to comply with it, and it can be over investment because like when we sign the PPA will be the long term, and we have to very difficult to say in the PPA that which year we need the flexibility and amount of the variation. So it would be good if we can have the intensive study on the market for the flexibility market. For example, that I have the name already, but the flexibility market. And the second is it would be good if we have the RE market. And the third is also possible, I think, if we have the regional RE market to in many level, and what each market, I think we have to study, and we would like to ask if IEA we have if you have the project like this, please study and please think about that. The flexibility market, is it possible to have in Thailand instead of we make a change in the PPA, we use like a voluntary, and also we have the RE market that we can manage, and we don't have to curtailment option in the power purchase, but we ask them to cut off them their energy by themselves and make benefit from the market or something like this. I think it will be another option for the system flexibility in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nitat. So I'll just quickly turn to Dr. Poonpat if you have any.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank Dana and Randy for your comments on the multilateral power trade in ASEAN. And also, I think one of the things is that the contract will play an important role to expand the power trade in ASEAN, especially when we talk about the clean energy market. So I think this part will be the part that we need to work on further. What I would like to make sure is that maybe you have to pay more attention on the market structure in different countries. That might have be the setting up for the some part might be the constraints and some part might be the opportunity as well. And how can we integrate different markets from country to countries? And that also requires a lot of things to work on in terms of planning for the generic contract, so that it can be more flexible to be applied by many countries. I think by that way, that will be promoting the market power trade in the ASEAN regions. And also my second point is about the, when we talk about the flexibility in the contract, I think the good thing about it is that we can increase the VRE, and we can also promote the multilateral power trade. But the other parts that we have to make sure and need to find a solution is that between the investor or who will be the promoter on the project, they might want to see another angle on the law enforcement. In this part, how can you ensure them that when they put money in the project and they can be confident that their money will not be lost by giving too much flexibility in the contract. This part might be something that you need to take care on. And also in terms of the government point of view, I think the security of supply between the buyer and sellers. In terms of the buyers, we also need to ensure the stable supply of the contract or of the power in that case. So I think all the things I would like to thank you IEA and EGAT for coming up with this good project and trying to find a way to making a progress on how can we see the RE integration in the grid and in the power system, not only in Thailand, expanded further. I would like to comment on your good part and your good work, hard work on this part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Poonpat, and thank you very much, Dr. Nitat, for the recommendation and suggestions on the next step. Of course, we will discuss further, and IA is keen to work in Thailand on the next step of our analysis. Thanks again to all the panelists, Dr. Nitat, Dr. Poonpat, Randy, and Dana, for an interesting discussions. Now I would like to hand over to Alejandro, the head of our unit, to give closing remarks. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Pierre Pat. I would like to close this workshop thanking all the participants. I would like to, first of all, congratulate the team that was involved. I think it's a very successful report, and I'm sure it will provide a lot of interesting insights. I hope I would like to clarify something that is very important. When the executive director of Fatih decided that the IEA was meant to be a global energy organization, it began the process of the association countries. And I think Thailand is one of the most successful cases. And but I must be very clear that it is the IEA who gets richer with this kind of joint work. So we learn and we are very grateful for the fact that all the contributions of Thailand, so providing us the time, the data, the contracts, is like opening the doors of your house. So I understand that. I really appreciate, and what I would like to say is that this gets the IEA way richer, but besides that, this is a real contribution for our work, because these things that we learn by working with you, we can also share these learnings and these practices with other countries. So I would like to close the workshop thanking you for this and looking forward to address all the interesting questions that have been addressed. And I'm looking forward for the next steps as well. Thanks, everyone. See you later.